So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are connecting today on the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki nations, or the Wabanaki Confederacy, as well as the Innu and Inuit peoples. This territory is covered by treaties of peace and friendship, which these nations first signed with the British Crown in 1726. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And it is in this spirit of peace and friendship that I greet you all today. Again, I want to excitedly welcome you to our September Innovation Speaker Series. Our goal and mission here at the Atlantic Canada Climate Network is to connect folks working on climate action within Atlantic Canada to center justice, collaborate effectively, and leverage available resources and capacity efficiently as we reduce emissions and respond to climate change impacts. So our goal here is to actually reduce the barriers and create collaboration across Atlantic Canada. We aim to critique dominant ways of knowing, thinking, and doing, and to bring in new perspectives, encourage engaging different methodologies, voices, worldviews, and opportunities for education to all Atlantic Canadians. With this, Marine Renewable Canada is Canada's National Association for Tidal, Offshore Wind, Wave, and River Current Energy, representing a membership of technology and project developers, suppliers, utilities, Indigenous organizations, researchers, and communities. Since 2004, the association has worked to build the sector by advocating for supportive policies, building domestic international business development opportunities, and providing education and outreach, as well as disseminating market intelligence. So today, we are very excited to hear from Lisen Bassett of Marine Renewable Canada. She is their policy and communications lead. Now, Lisen is responsible for monitoring and analyzing the legal and regulatory landscape governing marine renewable energy, as well as developing policy input and recommendations that foster growth for the industry and implementing effective outreach and communication strategies. So we're very excited to welcome Lisen, who has previously practiced in law, both in-house and in energy efficiency consulting firms, as well as in private practice. So we're very excited to have you here, Lisen. And with that, I will send it over to you.
Okie dokie. I guess I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And then a housekeeping note. So Ashley will be monitoring the chat throughout my presentation. And so if you have any questions throughout, feel free to go in the chat. And if there's something that needs to be clarified, we'll do our best to address that quickly. Otherwise, hopefully we will have some time at the end for questions, so we can open it up for a more casual dialogue at that point. So as Ashley said, I'm Lisen. I work for Marine Renewables Canada and doing policy and communications work. And today I'm going to be giving you sort of a high-level overview of marine renewable energy in Canada, give a picture of what even marine renewable energy is, just because, so we can all be on the same, share some common language, because I'm not sure where everybody's at with that in the audience. So I'll give you some basics about marine renewable energy, some highlights about projects that are happening in Canada, some of the challenges that the industry faces, some of the solutions that Marine Renewables Canada and others are working on, and some of the stuff that you can look forward to seeing in Canada from this sector. So hopefully, if you're not so familiar with marine renewables, I'll pique your curiosity, and I'll be, my info will be up at the end, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation with anybody going forward. Again, it will be kind of high level, but hopefully give you a general sense of what we're talking about when we talk about marine renewable energy. So, basic picture of what marine renewable energy is. These are forms of energy that work with the movement of water. So we have tidal energy that works with the movement of the tides in the ocean to create renewable energy. River current energy, similar, it works with the natural flow of moving water. It's different from hydro and damming in that it doesn't constrain water movement. It works with its natural flow. Offshore wind energy is also considered marine renewable energy. So that's like wind energy that we see on land, except for that it's out at sea and working with offshore winds. And then there's wave energy that works with the movement of waves and converting that into a source of renewable energy. So those are the big four types. Because these, I'm going to be getting into them a little bit more, the specifics of each of those in the presentation, but because it's an emerging sector, there's tons of different technologies out there. So you'll get a big picture of the types of technologies that you could see, but there will be more and I won't be able to cover them all. But that's okay. You'll get a big picture. In terms of our work at Marine Renewables Canada, our mission is really to grow the marine renewable energy space in Canada. And we do that by working on supportive policy frameworks and legislation, especially with emerging industries. Supportive policy is really important to kickstart an industry. As Ashley mentioned, we have companies throughout the supply chain that are members of ours. So we represent these companies. So everyone from, let's say, a developer of tidal and offshore wind energy to shipbuilders, utilities, steel manufacturers, really the whole gambit of the supply chain is we do represent, through that. And so we work on developing the supply chain in Canada, making connections between companies to make sure that we understand where their gaps are. We also foster national and international business development for these companies so that Canada can participate in other marine renewable energy markets worldwide. And then we do public education and stakeholder engagement work to get the word out about marine renewable energy and to engage the interested parties in these projects. So big picture, here's a snapshot of marine renewable energy activity in Canada. So as you can see, we have activity on both coasts. I'll be going through some of these projects, hitting a lot of these projects throughout the presentation. But there's more activity, I would say, especially towards the commercial scale on the East Coast and in Atlantic Canada than there is on the West Coast. Part of that is, for offshore wind, for example, and tidal energy, the resource in Atlantic Canada is insane. Like globally speaking, tides in the Bay of Fundy are some of the strongest in the world. Offshore wind off of Atlantic Canada is very, very strong as well. And then there's been a lot more policy and regulatory movement in Atlantic Canada compared to the West Coast. But the types of projects we're seeing on the West Coast are really, really interesting as well. And they've focused a lot on decarbonizing remote communities and working on energy autonomy and getting communities off of diesel. So a bit smaller scale, but extremely complex and interesting projects. And I'll get into some of those as well. So starting with wave and river current energy, some technology basics just to get us all on the same page. Wave energy works using something that's floating on the surface of the water. So it can look like a little buoy or a little platform. Waves have a nearly consistent motion in the ocean, especially along the shoreline, and that device will move with the waves. That energy is transferred down through, maybe as you're seeing on the left here, either like a weight system or a pump system, and then that energy is transferred in a cable, and that can go towards the grid or towards a substation. So that's sort of the basics of wave energy. One of the key advantages of wave energy is that it's nearly constant. So winds blowing, especially along the shoreline, create waves nearly all the time. So it's a very reliable and constant source of energy, which is great when we're talking about a grid's energy mix. You want different types of energy in a grid to make grid reliability, and constant sources of energy are great. River current energy, you see on the right here, that picture is a real device that's being deployed by one of our members, ORPC. And as I mentioned, river current energy is not like hydro where you're constraining the movement of water to create power and force. It's really just working with the flow, the natural one-directional flow of water. So rivers flow, again, like wave energy, constantly in one direction. And as you can see in this platform, there would be kind of turbines that would descend into the water and turn with the flow of that water. So again, constant source of power, very good for power output and reliability. And then especially compared to hydro, and when we're looking at rivers, it's a much smaller footprint and does not involve the changing of a river's flow of water. So that's quite positive. In terms of wave energy in Canada, we do have several projects that are very interesting. The projects that I'm going to be talking about, by the way, in the presentation today are basically all members of ours. So they're projects that we're more familiar with. And of course, there are other projects as well, but we'll be focusing on those that our members are putting out there and that we're more familiar with. So one wave energy project that's very interesting in BC is the UQuat project. That is a partnership between the Pacific Regional Institute for Marine Energy Discovery, PRIMED, which is a branch of the University of Victoria, in partnership with the, and I'm looking at pronunciation so that I get it right, but the Moachat Muchalat First Nation, Barclay Project Group, and Environmental Dynamics, 2 other companies. So the idea behind this project is to get this village of UQuat, which is on Nootka Island in BC, to be autonomous from an energy perspective. Currently, there's only about 2 to 3 people, I believe, that live in that village full time. And the idea long term would be a full reoccupation of that village. But because it's remote, it's very hard to get energy there. Remote communities tend to function based on diesel. So this wave energy project is looking at feeding renewable energy to their grid and allowing for the reoccupation of that village. So that's in its demonstration phases. And it's at the beginnings of the project, but very interesting. And we look forward to seeing how that project develops. Another interesting use of wave energy is for desalination. So Oneka Technologies is a company that we work with based out of Quebec, but they work worldwide. And they use a combination of wave energy, and then they have solar panels, as you can see, sort of on the device as well, that help power what's going on the device, and that turns seawater into fresh water. So it's very interesting, completely renewable desalination process. So they have a variety of scales that they work with. They have commercial and community scale projects. They have pilot, smaller projects, and then they're looking at emergency relief as well, which is very interesting. So providing fresh water, carbon-free fresh water in emergency situations. Finally, on river current energy, this is another great example of working with remote communities. So one of our members, ORPC, has been working on the deployment of their river current energy device in a remote community in Alaska, so not in Canada. Their testing center is based in Canada, but they're working with a remote community in Alaska. And that community has been entirely based on diesel for a long time. Diesel is very expensive and carbon intensive. And so they're looking at supplementing some of their energy with this river current device. And that device is deployed and been testing, and they are looking at connecting to the grid officially at the end of this year. So again, it'll be very interesting to see how these projects develop and really how much energy these devices can bring to a remote, to a grid. Moving on to tidal energy. Tidal energy works with the force of the tides, obviously. So there's different types of technologies, again, probably more than even this image depicts. But the 2 most common types of technologies that we see are horizontal axis and vertical axis turbines. So horizontal axis is the most common that we see worldwide, and it works by essentially as the movement of the tides is going this way. You'd have a turbine that's spinning kind of horizontally in the face of those tides. Vertical axis turbines turn more with the tide, like it's less of a I don't have the right word to describe it, but it's a little less of a conflict there in terms of the tide and the device. Energy output is similar, but they're just 2 different ways of working with the power of tides to create energy. An older piece of technology that we did have in Canada, and there have been deployments all over the world of tidal barrages and lagoons. You don't really see those anymore because, as you can see, it's the bottom right image here. It's similar to hydropower in the sense that it constricts the movement of water into one place to try to concentrate the power. And that type of technology was being deployed as early as the 60s and 70s in Europe and in the 80s in Canada. And there were just more environmental effects with that technology than there are with the more modern tidal technologies. So again, similar to hydro, when you constrain the movement of water, we know that there are just more effects downstream and locally. So that we've moved away from that technology and towards these vertical and horizontal access technologies. One of the biggest advantages of tidal energy is how predictable it is. So you all know that, whether you've surfed or fished or whatever it is, gone out into the water, you know that you can look up when high tide is and when low tide is very far in advance. So tides are constant and predictable, which is wonderful, again, for the reliability of our grid. Intermittent renewables like solar and wind don't produce energy all the time. So if the sun isn't shining, we're not necessarily producing solar energy at that time. Same with wind. Tides are moving all the time and at a very predictable way. So that's a great source of energy that we can insert into our grid to increase consistency and reliability and reduce volatility. So tidal energy is not new, especially across the globe. There are a lot of test centers that exist worldwide, which is the map that you see on the left. And then there are many, many deployed devices as well. So actual tidal energy projects that are in the water and producing energy worldwide. I'll get into this a little bit more later. We did have a tidal energy project that was deployed in Canada. It's no longer in the water anymore due to a series of challenges, some of which I can get into a little bit later, but we did have a successful tidal deployment where energy was fed to the grid in Canada, which is great. Scotland is a really interesting jurisdiction for us when we look at best practices. They have some of the largest deployments of multi-device, so several tidal turbines in the world. And part of that reason is because their policies and their regulatory framework is quite advanced, and they have very supportive policies there. The UK just had a renewable energy lease auction as well, and several tidal projects, I think 8 of them were selected and will receive government funding. So we work closely with the UK energy associations as well, and it's really nice to see that movement there, and there's a lot that we can learn here in Canada from that as well. Some highlights of tidal energy in Canada. In BC, we have the Blind Channel Demonstration Center. So that is an interesting project where it's looking at connecting tidal energy to a resort nearby, a remote resort called Blind Channel. So they're looking at a hybrid system to power that resort. So using tidal energy, solar energy, and diesel as well. With an energy storage capacity. So that this is a demonstration site, and they're looking at eventually being able to power the resort and show sort of, what that grid could look like. So they've been recently awarded $2 million by the BC government, which is great, an injection of funds there, and they're moving along quite nicely with that project. So we will see tidal energy movement in BC as well, which is great. The most activity in Canada that we see in the tidal energy industry is in Nova Scotia. And part of this is just the resource that's there. As I mentioned, the Bay of Fundy has some of the most powerful tides in the world. So for a long time, we've been trying to figure out how to harness those tides because they're there and they would be a great source of renewable energy. This timeline gives you a sense of just how long the Bay of Fundy has been looked at for tidal energy. So as I mentioned, we did have a barrage system in Canada in the 80s that was shut down. Again, we've moved away from tidal barrages and lagoons to less impactful tidal technology. And one of the ways that technology can improve is just by deployment and testing. So they need to be able to put, devices in the water and see what happens in order to make improvements over time. And in Nova Scotia, the Fundy Ocean Research Centre for Energy, or FORCE, has played a huge role in getting the tidal technology where it is today in Canada. And it's seen as one of the leading areas worldwide in terms of this demonstration structure that we have set up in the Bay of Fundy at FORCE. So FORCE has received basically a crown seabed lease for the seabed in the Bay of Fundy in a specific area. They've divided that up into what they call berths. So those are areas where tidal devices can be deployed. So there are 3 developers there currently with licenses that are deploying different types of technology. Each developer, as part of being at FORCE, gets cabling that then goes to the grid, to a substation, and then to the grid. So that infrastructure is there for them. And then FORCE also helps with by leading environmental monitoring and research and development. That's particularly necessary in the Bay of Fundy because one of the big challenges there, even though the tides are so powerful and the energy resource potential there is absolutely insane, the water is very silty. So it's very difficult to see what's going on underwater in the Bay of Fundy. And part of the research and development of tidal energy is having cameras or sensors down with the device and seeing how marine life interacts with the device, how the water's flowing through it. So FORCE has been really leading the way in terms of looking at other ways of sensing interactions with its environment. A few project highlights in Canada. So we do have deployed tidal energy, both at FORCE and at other areas in Nova Scotia. The first 2 that you see here from left to right, Nova Innovation and DP Energy's projects, are both examples of horizontal axis tidal turbines. So DP is at FORCE and they've done some final site characterization work. Nova Innovation has actually fabricated their first device. And then Big Moon Power on the right is an example of more of a paddle wheel technology. They're also at FORCE and they're looking at deploying later this year. So lots of movement there, which is great. In terms of the high-level challenges, and I'm grouping wave, river, current, and tidal together because they do face similar challenges because of where the technologies are at. Tidal energy is a little more advanced than wave and river current, but they still have similar challenges. Different from offshore wind, which is the last type of technology that I'm going to be talking about today. Offshore wind is commercial scale already, and it's been deployed worldwide at that scale. So different challenges for that technology. For wave, river, current, and tidal, one of the big challenges is that it's a higher cost of energy. As I was mentioning with technology improvements, the more deployment you have, the better the technology gets. So the more devices we can put in the water, the more improvement we'll see over time. And so the same thing for cost, the more deployment, the lower the cost. So because there hasn't been as much deployment worldwide of these technologies, costs are still high compared to other renewables. But that's one of the things that we work on at MRC is increasing deployment in order to lower costs and make these technologies more viable and more interesting. The other big challenge, and the same would go for offshore wind, although we are getting some specific legislation for offshore wind, is the lack of fit for purpose legislation. So what I mean by that is legislation that actually addresses and that was written and drafted for marine renewable energy. How we've worked in Canada is by working with legislation that already exists. So for example, if you want to put something in the ocean, any device, let's say a tidal energy device or anything else, you need to get an authorization through the Fisheries Act, which will look at how that device impacts fish and fish habitat. And then that device can either be authorized or not, depending on that perceived impact and the evidence behind it. So one of the challenges with that is just that the Fisheries Act was not drafted with tidal energy in mind or with marine renewable energy in mind. It was drafted for fishing industry. So it's challenging to work within those types of frameworks that really didn't envision these technologies. But there's not a clear solution to this sort of regulatory issue, because legislation, if you do want fit for purpose legislation, takes a really long time to pass laws in Canada and in most places. So these developers are trying to deploy technologies and test them, and industry always wants to move quickly. So passing fit for purpose legislation takes a long time. Working with legislation we have that has nothing to do with marine renewables also has its challenges. So these are the kinds of sort of policy and regulatory issues that we work with, and that we try to help find solutions to. Another issue is attracting investment for these types of for tidal and river and wave. There tend to be smaller projects. Investors like big commercial projects. Investors also like regulatory certainty. So the more that we can have policy that addresses marine renewables, the better that Canada can set itself up for investment. And then technology challenges exist too. Oceans are incredibly harsh environments, and it's difficult to test and demonstrate these projects. So there have been challenges with the actual technology as well. One of the highlights or the solutions with tidal energy in terms of the policy and regulatory domain is recently to address some of those issues that I was talking about with the Fisheries Act and tidal energy. The federal government, Fisheries and Ocean Canada, DFO, and Natural Resources Canada have come together to create a tidal task force with the help of Force and Marine Renewables Canada and the provincial government of Nova Scotia to try to address that issue. How do we build a regulatory framework for tidal? How do we work within the Fisheries Act in a way that makes sense for everybody? And so that kind of, multi-party task force is a really interesting example of trying to tackle that kind of regulatory issue. Just quick water before we get into offshore wind. So this is the last piece of technology that I'll talk about, and it's sort of the last big picture of marine renewable energy. Offshore wind, you're going to be hearing a lot about because there's an immense deployment worldwide. Again, with this technology, there are tons of ways of building offshore wind and different types of structures, but the big two categories are fixed and floating. So fixed is very similar to what we see onshore, but the monopile or the structure would be, the tower of it would be fixed to the seabed. Whereas with floating, there's the turbine that's on a floating platform on top of the ocean, and then it's connected to the seabed with cabling. It can look like a million different things. Developers have all sorts of different ways of deploying that. But the big difference is that fixed is in more shallow water, so up to 60 meters depth, and floating can access deeper waters. So, about 80% of the offshore wind resources in deeper waters. And so floating is a little bit more behind fixed. You see a lot more fixed deployed worldwide, but there's real potential to access the offshore wind resource with floating. Floating is also very interesting for our West Coast. Nova Scotia and our Atlantic coast has a seabed that from the shore goes down gradually. Big picture, it goes down gradually, whereas on the West Coast, the continental shelf drops very quickly. So you have deep water very close to shore. So floating offshore wind will be very interesting for our West Coast. And in the US, the offshore wind auction that they had on the West Coast was entirely floating. So it gives you an example of where we could use that technology. And importantly, although offshore wind is new for us in Canada, we don't have any offshore wind deployed yet. It's not new worldwide. The first offshore wind farm was deployed in 1991 in Denmark, And the North Sea and Europe is still where you see the most amount of deployment because they got an early start. Some more basics. So how power is produced from offshore wind, very similar to onshore wind in that wind turns a turbine, and that energy is then transferred through cabling to a substation. In offshore wind, that substation can either be not floating, but it would be at sea or on land. Then that energy can go to the grid, or it can go to, let's say, a green hydrogen production facility, which is one of the big uses of offshore wind. I'll get into that a little bit later. Size-wise, in terms of comparing it to onshore wind, turbines are a lot bigger than onshore wind turbines, and they're getting bigger and bigger. So again, like as technology improves, the bigger the turbine, the more output each turbine can have, and that means we can have a smaller footprint of an offshore wind farm because you could deploy fewer turbines for the same output. So that's the turbines are getting bigger. And then typically it takes about 10 years to build an offshore wind farm from the point where seabed would be leased. So we have seabed leased. It takes about 10 years to go from that point to commercial operation. So a pretty long time to build that piece of technology. And it just gives you a sense of, when we talk about wanting offshore wind in Canada, we haven't had a lease yet. The first one is projected for 2025 in Nova Scotia, and it'll be another likely 10 years before we see an offshore wind farm in operation. So we're in it for the long haul, but it's exciting. So it's a big market globally, and it's growing very rapidly. There's about 55 gigawatts installed globally as of 2021. Most of that installed capacity, about 70%, is in Europe. So they had a much earlier start, and they've built a lot of offshore wind with much more restricted access to ocean too, like in terms of the amount of ocean that they have access to compared to Canada. They're working with much less, and they have more countries vying for portions of the ocean. So that's kind of a nice indication for Canada in terms of where we could go with it. We have a lot of resource here, as we do with all of our natural resources. We're very fortunate. And then it's a rapidly growing market. There's a lot more offshore wind in the pipeline. About 370 gigawatts are projected by 2031. So a lot of that is being driven by China. China builds a lot of offshore wind. And then the US has come up the curve by setting a lot of aggressive deployment targets, and they're building offshore wind farms now. They have one operational offshore wind farm in the US at small scale, feeding an island, but they're deploying commercial offshore wind now as well. So some reasons why we would even look at offshore wind in Canada, why it's interesting. So especially in Atlantic Canada, and in Nova Scotia, there's still coal in the grid. So decarbonizing our grids is an important goal with the realities of climate change. Nova Scotia in particular has an 80% renewable energy electricity so their target is to make their grid 80% renewable by 2030. So we need more sources of renewable energy. Offshore wind is a very good resource for grids because winds offshore tend to be stronger and more constant than the winds onshore. The power output of offshore wind farms is higher than their onshore counterparts. So that's the scale that you can deploy offshore wind at is very promising for trying to decarbonize the grid. As we decarbonize, that means we're electrifying more, which just means that our electricity demand is going to go up over time. So again, we just need more sources of renewable energy if we're going to meet that demand locally. As I mentioned with the different types of technology, having different renewable energy sources in the grid increases grid reliability and protects against volatility. So if you have constant sources like tidal and more intermittent sources like solar, wind, and offshore wind, then that creates a good mix that is meeting the demand. And then the global market is also volatile, especially with the crisis in Ukraine and that conflict. A lot of Europe had to get off Russian gas and is in the process of getting off Russian gas. And so their needs for energy are higher than they've ever been. So there's a really big opportunity for Canada and for others to export our renewable energy to markets that need it, like Europe. And then there's a local economic opportunity too. So offshore wind requires a skilled workforce, and luckily, especially in Atlantic Canada, we have a very strong history of maritime and offshore work, and so our supply chain is very strong. Also in Atlantic Canada, as I mentioned, we have some of the best offshore wind resources in the world. So this map, basically purple, is very good. So very high winds. So our wind speeds rival those of the North Sea. So they're comparable to the North Sea, which is where we see the most offshore wind deployment. In Atlantic Canada, we have that continental shelf that's more gradual, so we can deploy fixed and floating offshore wind. And our practical potential, so when you look at actually what can be deployed, is about 15 gigawatts. So that's very high. It's a conservative estimate, but that's quite a significant potential. And just to give you a sense, peak demand in Nova Scotia in the middle of winter is only 2.5 gigawatts. So Nova Scotia in particular is looking at hydrogen export for its as one of its primary offshore wind markets. And the reason for that is because the demand is lower than what we can output if we were to build more offshore wind there. So as I've mentioned, where can this offshore wind energy go? Well, ideally and hopefully it can go to our grids to further decarbonize our grids. The Atlantic Loop is a great example of something where that offshore wind energy from Nova Scotia could be deployed and shared amongst the Atlantic provinces or beyond. And then there are also options that are being looked at to export that energy to the US via a cabling system. So that's an exciting market that could open up if that infrastructure is built. Green fuels is another big market for offshore wind. So Canada and Germany, for example, have a hydrogen alliance where Canada is committing to provide Germany with green hydrogen. And offshore wind could play a huge role in creating green hydrogen, again, because it can be produced at scale. Hydrogen production takes a lot of energy. And so it's a very compatible source of renewable energy for hydrogen. The other big area is decarbonizing heavy industry. So the last sort of thing that I'll tell you about is what's been happening from a policy perspective for offshore wind in Canada. And hopefully this will give you a sense of what it will look like how offshore wind could really be deployed in Canada. So take you through this timeline. Just a regulatory framework was first announced in 2020. And it has been worked on by NRCan for a long time before that. So they're developing the offshore renewable energy regulations. Those are meant to come into force next year. So that provides an initial sort of regulatory framework for safety issues at sea and connecting to the grid. The other piece of legislation that will be important for actually deploying offshore wind is the Accord Acts. So in 2022, it was announced that the Accord Acts, and I'll tell you what those are, but that they would be modified to allow offshore wind to fall within them. So the Accord Acts were developed for offshore oil and gas, and they are a joint piece of legislation between the federal government and the province of Nova Scotia has one Accord Act, and then the federal government and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador has another Accord Act. So these are joint management. It would be a joint management regime, and it was designed for offshore oil and gas. And what NRCan proposed in 2022 was that that legislation be expanded to include offshore renewable energy like offshore wind. So what the Accord Acts have done, big picture, is to create offshore boards that are the lead regulator for offshore oil and gas. So those boards would remain, and they would regulate offshore wind. So this is a nice example. It's a very unique approach to Canada, and it's a very nice example of provincial and federal cooperation and modifying current legislation to be more fit for purpose for marine renewables. The other big piece of how offshore wind will actually happen in Canada from a regulatory perspective is the regional assessment. That was announced in 2022 as well. There will be a regional assessment led by the Impact Agency of Canada in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, so 2 separate regional assessments. And what those are essentially large-scale environmental impact assessments. So they're going to look at a big swath of ocean and try to see what areas should be explored, what areas shouldn't be explored, what's at stake, who the stakeholders are. So that's going to give us a big picture of where offshore wind could occur in Canada, and that will be shaved down further and further by the time we get to actual deployment and leasing of land. The big piece, I guess, for Atlantic Canada is that Nova Scotia has declared that they would begin leasing 5 gigawatts of offshore wind in 2025. So having a target like that is really what has driven that industry in Nova Scotia. So it means that, in 2 years, we're going to be looking at actually a lease. So we will know where offshore wind is going to happen in Canada. And that's very exciting. So all of these pieces of the puzzle come together to create a regulatory framework for offshore wind in Canada. The regional assessment that I talked about by the Impact Agency was launched this year. So committees have been chosen in both Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. Those committees are leading the regional assessments in these 2 provinces, and they will be wrapping up by next year. So we'll have that big picture of where offshore wind may and may not happen by next year. The Accord Acts that I discussed, which is the joint management regime, those acts, the modifications to that legislation was actually introduced into the House this year in May. So that legislation is being pushed forward. And then Nova Scotia most recently has released a draft offshore wind roadmap that gives a better picture of what they're intending to do. And one of the developments of the roadmap is that they're going to begin by leasing 1 gigawatt out of that 5 total target. So that's moving ahead. And then on the West Coast, we also recently had a very interesting call for renewable energy from BC Hydro. We haven't had a call in a long time on the West Coast. Similar to Quebec, Hydro in BC is really the main source of energy. So they're opening up a call for more renewable energy. And the idea for that energy is to go towards decarbonizing heavy industry, and offshore wind is particularly well suited for that. So we could see offshore wind opening up in BC as well. So that wraps it up for me. Thank you very much. I know that was a lot of information, but I hope it gave you an overview, what's going on in Canada, what marine renewable energy is, why it's interesting. Ultimately, we're trying to feed more renewable energy into our grids and into the rest of the world to reduce our, carbon intensity. And so on a personal note, that's very interesting. It's a very exciting space to work in. And my contact information is up. We'd be super happy to chat with anybody. And if you have questions, I am here now too.
We have our first question in the chat from David. What are the main challenges offshore wind project developers have in Nova Scotia, and how are they planning to overcome it?
So I think one of the biggest challenges in Nova Scotia and everywhere really is regulatory certainty. So having a clear picture for a developer of what legislation they're going to need to comply with, and how much overlap there will be between the pieces of legislation. So You know, are they going to have to deal with Department of Transport, with Nova Scotia Power, with NRCan, with DFO, and with the provincial government? Or is there going to be some kind of streamlined approach where the application process and the leasing process doesn't require them to have to meet the demands of each of those departments, and that each of those departments will have their own legislation? That would be a particularly challenging framework to deal with for a developer. So in the early stages where we're at now, industry, MRC, and developers are being engaged to give advice about how that regulatory framework could be structured to make it a little bit more straightforward for developers. And why that's important is this is something that investors are very, very curious about. So where there are clear regulatory frameworks, investors are more, they see it as a more certain investment. So regulatory certainty is a big one. And then I'd say in Atlantic Canada as well, realistically, stakeholder engagement is huge. So we're not going to be the only ones in the ocean, and we are not the first ones in the ocean by any means. And I mean we by offshore wind. So stakeholders like communities, First Nations, Indigenous groups, and the fisheries in particular in Canada, an extremely important industry, a long-standing industry. So things like marine spatial planning and stakeholder engagement to ensure the coexistence between ocean users will be key. It will be crucial if we're going to have offshore wind in Atlantic Canada.
Does the government consider the legislation and research performed by other countries, such as Scotland, when developing fit-for-purpose legislation?
Yes and no. Both. It's a great question. Ideally, yes. And they do look at other pieces of legislation when they're designing it. But you know, from our perspective, sometimes we feel that it's not enough. You know, that legislation doesn't have enough weight when we're designing ours in Canada. So we do that work a lot at least at MRC, is doing legislative analysis of other jurisdictions and trying to see what can be imported here in Canada and what can't. So one example that I would say, one difference internationally, like for example, Germany has a lot of offshore wind, and they're a very mature market, and there's so much that we can learn from them. But for example, their fisheries are not, it just doesn't have the same climate there. It's not the same industry as we have in Canada. So that stakeholder engagement piece, you don't see it as much in their legislation as we will need to have it in Canada. So not everything can be imported, but enough can, and we certainly do a lot of work to ensure that that legislation is being looked at as we improve our own and build it.
There was also a note in the presentation, there was a lot about Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. We're wondering where are PEI in New Brunswick in terms of the development and potential?
Was it directed at anything in particular, like offshore wind in particular, or just kind of more general?
Just general.
Okay. Yeah, so part of the picture is the resource itself. So yeah, Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, because Force was started there, you see more tile development there. PEI is definitely on the radar for offshore wind. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that offshore wind is looked at being deployed there, but everything that happens in the ocean, nothing happens in a silo anywhere. We know this from sort of basic environmental principles. So if you install an offshore wind farm or anything big infrastructure wise somewhere in the ocean, that will affect other areas of the ocean too. So PEI and PEI fishers, for example, are trying to get a sense of what's going on with offshore wind in Nova Scotia, to get a sense of whether they will be affected, whether lobster will be displaced, things like that. But one of the reasons why the focus on Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador is just because the policies are there, like the political will seems to be there. So we're seeing targets being set, we're seeing legislation being drafted. And then in New Brunswick and PEI, we don't see that stuff as much. So once we start to, if we start to see policy moving forward, then those areas will open up as well and become more interesting, I guess, for developers. Answering on it.
Another, you're doing amazing, by the way, Lisen. Another question here. There's a lot of issues surrounding tidal generation with respect to fisheries ecosystems. Oh, did somebody want to say something?
I'm asking what building is this? Is it the library or?
16.
Oh, I think that was just an accidental unmute. So what kind of parallel challenges would floating offshore wind have, particularly in the benthic environment where mooring anchors and chains would be in contact with the seabed?
Great question. So I'll start by saying there's some really good studies on the impacts on benthic, offshore wind and benthic interactions coming out of the US. So I can share those with Ashley and make sure they get to whoever has asked this question. But basically anywhere that you have cabling, which would happen with floating or with fixed, because fixed ultimately still the energy is going to be transmitted through a subsea cable. You do have the chance of EMF and like heat radiating off of those cables and electromagnetic fields being created, and then that can impact fish and fish habitat. So wait, sorry, can you, because when we got interrupted, the original of the question was it's a parallel between tidal and offshore and floating. Is that the idea with fisheries?
What parallel challenges would floating offshore wind have, particularly in the benthic environments where mooring anchors and chains would be in contact with the seabed?
Okay, yeah, so similar challenges as your question indicates, as wherever you have cabling. As I said, you have heat and the potential for EMF. How far you bury the cable will change that impact on the environment. And one of the big parallels is just the requirement for studies like we're seeing coming out of the US and out of the North Sea, out of Taiwan as well. They've been studying the impacts on fish and fish habitat of offshore wind there. So the more studies that are done, the better we can understand what the impacts really are and then mitigate as much as possible. So as I said, cable burial, for example, is how deep you bury it can change the impact. But you need to be able to understand what the impact is to begin with, to be able to develop a new way of addressing it. So cabling will have similar impacts. The difference, I would say, between tidal and especially tidal in Atlantic Canada and the Bay of Fundy, where offshore wind will likely be developed in Atlantic Canada, is the water will be much clearer, and you don't have the turbine in the water. So what you're monitoring and what you're able to see will change. So the types of monitoring that will be effective for offshore wind, you would be able to use video and imagery. Whereas for tidal in the Bay of Fundy, we really have to rely on sensors because the video and the pictures don't do anything for telling us how the tidal device is interacting with the habitat. But to be clear on impacts in terms of tidal, in terms of what has been recorded worldwide, tidal devices, singular tidal devices, barrages were a different story, but singular tidal devices are not interacting with, are not interrupting and interacting and impacting marine life and fish. So fish are avoiding the tidal turbine essentially. But research and monitoring is required to make sure that that's the case. And we'll continue that with offshore wind, obviously, as well.
Will international, specifically Europeans, due to their experience and track record, will international technology providers and engineering companies be involved in shaping the offshore wind in Canada? And how will they get involved?
Yeah, so absolutely, they will be involved, and there are international companies throughout the supply chain that are interested in the Canadian market. I can't tell who that question is coming from, so I can't tell what exactly the idea would be there, but one of the things that we work on is boosting local supply chains. So looking at local companies and the capacity that we already have here. But when it comes to things like the crew transfer vessels and these large, because offshore wind monopiles and the turbines are huge, like it really shocked. We were recently in Germany and we saw some of these pieces, and it really shocked me how large they are. It's really interesting. So the vessels that need to transport that equipment, they're huge and they take forever to build, and we don't have them here, and the US doesn't even have them. They're starting to build these vessels. So we will need vessels, for example, from Europe in order to transfer these devices. So companies can definitely, European companies can look at getting involved through a variety of means, like associations like ours, like the Canadian-German Chamber of Commerce. There's lots of different associations that will hook up companies with local companies. And so that's a really good way of kind of getting the lay of the land locally and getting into a market like Canada's.
Very interesting. Here's a good question too. How big an impact will extreme weather conditions like hurricanes play in large-scale development and the deployment of marine renewables in Atlantic Canada? And is there any ongoing study on the risk of extreme weather conditions?
Very interesting question. Yeah, ocean environments are crazy. Just like the offshore wind turbines are crazy big, the ocean environment is absolutely insane. Luckily in Canada, we have, like, as I said, a very strong history of working in harsh environments in the ocean. So we're well prepared. But yes, weather does affect specifically development and deployment. So the windows of when you can go out and lay cable, for example, the cable laying vessels will have different capacities for wave height. So when they're like, you know, we learned this again on our trip in Germany, because they have all of these vessels deployed already, but it looks like they'll have a vessel with a big thimble with cable that's being spun out and laid down, and those vessels can only handle a certain amount of wave height. So the window for deployment becomes very tight, and Atlantic Canada will face the same things. In Atlantic Canada, the seabed is quite good. It's quite favorable for cable laying, especially around Sable Island, where there's already some old oil and gas infrastructure that's out there. So we know a little bit more about that area in terms of how we can deploy. But yes, harsh weather affects the window of time that we have to work with, and it will limit that for sure.
Is there any aftermarket for previous generation equipment for areas that have limited budget?
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
I can't say that I've heard of an aftermarket. I know that like turbine recycling and structure, like steel recycling from these offshore structures, for example, in offshore wind is something that can happen. It's recycling that amount of steel is a long process, and it's obviously very complex, but the ideal situation is that, you know, at the end of a turbine's lifespan for offshore wind, that would be about 25 years. You would either fully decompose and recycle, or you could refurbish and redeploy. So in terms of what that redeployment would be, that's a really good question. And I'd love to see that market developed. I don't know of that market, but I think it sounds like a really good opportunity if it's there.
and here's one last question in the chat as we hit our time moment. Will the necessary federal legislative changes and new legislation be in place before the next federal election?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know when the election's going to be, but yeah, it highlights an area of I wouldn't say vulnerability, but just another piece of complexity for the policy puzzle is, of course, changes in government that can change the climate very quickly. I don't know exactly, you know, what pieces of legislation will be in place by what times. Various things can prolong those timelines, of course. But for example, the Accord Acts are supposed to be in place by 2024. So potentially before the election, but also potentially not, depending how things go. But something that we've been looking at for sure is, regardless of a change in government, something like offshore wind in particular is a big commercial and infrastructure project. It is renewable energy, but it's also just a huge infrastructure project. Those bring a lot of jobs, a lot of economic opportunity. So that would appeal to many different governments. And then tidal energy as well. We've seen in some of it got, you know, when it got a little bit political at different times, the tidal energy piece lately. So we've seen that tidal energy can also appeal to all over the political spectrum, because again, it promotes energy autonomy. It's a local piece of energy. It stimulates local economy. So I'm not worried. It can obviously, changes of government can slow things down, but marine renewable energy can speak a lot of different languages, and it has a lot of appeal. So I think we can be confident, regardless of where our politics go, that we'll see this energy develop.
Well, with that, so much gratitude for you, Lisen, for being here today. If there's any follow-up questions, Lisen's contact information is right here on the board, or you can contact us at the Atlantic Canada Climate Network, and we would love to forward any of those questions. We will also forward any information that comes with Lisen, as well as the recording to this presentation, to everybody that signed up today, and it will also be available on YouTube. With that, so much gratitude. Thank you so much, Lisen.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.